The return to Uchi was fraught with tension, and each step felt heavier than the last for Oba and Nkem. The air was thick with whispers as villagers stopped in their tracks, turning to watch the pair who had once been a central part of the community. Oba kept his head high, his jaw set in determination, though his heart pounded as if it might burst from his chest. He could feel the weight of their stares, sharp and unrelenting, and the murmur of their voices carried fragments of words he wished he hadn't heard. "They shouldn't be here," someone whispered, their voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Have they really changed?" another muttered. Nkem walked a step behind her son, her shoulders hunched and her gaze fixed firmly on the ground. She had spent countless nights imagining this moment, rehearsing the words she might say if given the chance. But now that the moment had arrived, she found herself mute. The weight of her mistakes, the pain she had caused, bore down on her like an invisible shroud. Her once proud posture was gone, replaced by a humility she hadn't known she was capable of. The sounds of the village children laughing in the distance, the rhythmic pounding of yams, the crackle of a cooking fire felt like a distant echo, a reminder of a life she had nearly destroyed. Elder Oaf stood at the center of the square, his staff planted firmly in the ground as he waited for them to approach. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone silenced the murmurs of the crowd. Oba and Nkem came to a stop a few paces from him, their heads bowed in deference. The elder's voice, deep and steady, carried over the gathering. "Nkem and Oba," he began, "you have been granted a second chance, but it is not forgiveness you are owed. It is an opportunity to atone, to rebuild the trust you have broken. Your actions will speak louder than any words." His gaze shifted from Oba to Nkem, his eyes narrowing as he continued. "You will work harder than anyone in this village. From dawn until dusk, your labor will benefit the community. And perhaps, in time, you will prove that you are worthy of the lives you once had." Oba nodded solemnly. "Yes, Elder. I understand," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his throat. Nkem echoed his words, though her voice was barely above a whisper. The elder studied them for a moment longer before turning to address the crowd. "They will be watched," he said, his tone firm. "Their every action will be a testament to their sincerity. Let us not forget that redemption is a path, not a destination." With that, he dismissed the gathering, and the villagers began to disperse, their chatter resuming as they returned to their daily routines. The first days were grueling. Oba and Nkem were given the most laborious tasks, from hauling water from the river to repairing broken fences and tending to the fields. Oba threw himself into the work with a determination that surprised even himself. Each swing of the hoe, each drop of sweat that fell, felt like a step toward redemption. His hands, once soft and unblemished, were soon calloused and raw from the hours of toil. Yet he didn't complain. He welcomed the pain, the exhaustion, as a reminder of the commitment he had made. At first, the men in the fields avoided him, their conversations ceasing whenever he came near. Oba could feel the weight of their judgment, the unspoken words that lingered in their glances. But he didn't let it deter him. He worked harder than anyone else, often staying long after the others had left. Slowly, the men began to acknowledge his efforts. A nod here, a brief word of encouragement there. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The younger boys, however, were less guarded. They watched him with wide eyes, their admiration growing with each passing day. One afternoon, as Oba rested under the shade of a tree, a boy approached him hesitantly. "Oba, why do you work so hard?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Oba smiled faintly, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Because I want to make things right," he said simply. The boy nodded thoughtfully, his gaze lingering on the callus on Oba's hands. From that day on, the boy and a few of his friends began to follow Oba, mimicking his actions and peppering him with questions about the work they were doing. Nkem's journey was quieter, but no less challenging. She spent her days with the women of the village, learning to weave baskets, tend gardens, and prepare meals for the elders. At first, her presence was met with cold stares and whispered judgments, but over time, her humility began to soften their hearts. She asked questions, listened intently, and never once let her pride interfere with her efforts to learn. The young girls, curious and eager to learn, began to approach her hesitantly. "Mama Nkem, "Can you show us how to weave like you?" one of them asked one afternoon. Nkam's hands trembled as she took the girl's hand in hers, guiding her through the motions. "Of course, my dear," she said softly. "It's not as hard as it looks." As the weeks turned into months, the walls of mistrust that had surrounded Oba and Nkem began to crack. The villagers, once skeptical of their intentions, started to see the sincerity in their actions. Oba became a fixture in the daily life of Uchi, his once doubted presence now a source of inspiration. The young boys who followed him in the fields mirrored his every action, their laughter and chatter a reminder of the life he had almost lost. The mornings in Uchi began before the sun had fully risen, the quiet hum of the village stirring to life as smoke began to rise from the thatched rooftops. For Oba, the day started with the sounds of the roosters crowing and the rhythmic pounding of yam in the distance. He would rise from his mat, his body aching from the previous day's labor, and step outside to breathe in the crisp air. Each morning felt like a new beginning, a chance to prove to himself and to the villagers that he could rebuild what he had broken. He made his way to the fields, where the earth still bore the morning dew. The other men were already there, some preparing the tools while others gathered near the stream to fill their water gourds. Oba approached quietly, picking up a hoe and joining them without a word. At first, they barely acknowledged him, their conversations continuing as though he weren't there. But Oba didn't mind. He had grown accustomed to their silence, to the unspoken tension that hung in the air whenever he was near. He worked steadily, his movements precise and deliberate, the sound of the hoe cutting through the soil a rhythm that matched the beat of his heart. As the hours passed, the sun rose higher, its warmth spreading across the fields. Oba's shirt clung to his back, soaked with sweat, but he didn't slow down. He focused on the task at hand, his mind quiet except for the occasional thoughts of his mother. He wondered how she was faring with the women, whether they were as harsh with her as the men were with him. Though they rarely spoke about it, he knew she carried her own burden of guilt, one that weighed on her as heavily as his own. Nkem, meanwhile, had found herself in the midst of the village women, her hands fumbling awkwardly as she tried to keep up with their practiced movements. She was weaving a basket, the reeds slipping through her fingers as she struggled to maintain the pattern. The other women watched her out of the corners of their eyes, their expressions unreadable. Nkem felt their judgment keenly, but she kept her head down and her focus on the task before her. "Not like that," one of the women said finally, her tone clipped. She reached over and took the basket from Nkem's hands, her movements swift and efficient as she corrected the pattern. "You have to tighten the reeds here, or it won't hold." Nkem nodded, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Thank you," she said softly, taking the basket back and trying again. The woman didn't respond, but there was a slight softening in her expression, a hint that perhaps Nkem's efforts were beginning to make an impression. The younger girls, however, were more curious than critical. They gathered around Nkem, their laughter and chatter a welcome distraction from the tension that lingered between her and the other women. "Mema Nkem," one of them said, her voice bright with excitement, "can you teach us how to make a basket like that?" Nkem hesitated, her fingers stilling on the reeds. She looked at the girls, their wide-eyed eagerness a stark contrast to the wary glances of the women around her. Slowly, she nodded. "Of course," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Come, sit with me." The girls crowded around her, their small hands reaching for the reeds as Nkem guided them through the process. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her voice soft as she explained each step. "You see, you have to be patient," she told them. "If you rush, the basket will fall apart. But if you take your time and do it carefully, it will be strong and beautiful." The girls nodded, their faces serious as they worked. Their laughter rang out occasionally, breaking through the tension like sunlight piercing through a cloud. As the days turned into weeks, Nkem began to notice a change in the way the women treated her. Though they still kept their distance, their remarks grew less cutting, their glances less hostile. They began to offer small words of advice, showing her how to improve her weaving or how to prepare certain dishes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Nkem hope that she might one day regain their trust. Oba, too, began to notice subtle shifts in the way the men treated him. One afternoon, as they rested under the shade of a large tree, one of the older men, Gora, spoke up. "You've been working hard," he said, his tone gruff but not unkind. "Harder than most." Oba looked up, surprised by the comment. "Thank you," he said simply, not knowing what else to say. Gora nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Keep it up," he said before rising and returning to work. The younger boys who followed Oba were less reserved in their admiration. They watched him closely, mimicking his movements and peppering him with questions. "Oba, how do you know where to plant the seeds?" one of them asked one day. Oba crouched down, scooping up a handful of soil and letting it fall through his fingers. "You look at the soil," he explained. "The darker and richer it is, the better it will be for planting. And you have to make sure it's moist enough for the seeds to grow." The boys listened intently, their faces serious as they examined the soil in their own hands. "And what about water?" another boy asked. Oba smiled, pointing to the irrigation trenches they had dug earlier. "That's why we make these. They help the water reach every part of the field so the crops can grow strong." The boys nodded, their admiration for Oba evident in their wide-eyed expressions. Despite the progress they were making, both Oba and Nkem knew that the road ahead was still long and fraught with challenges. There were still whispers, still wary glances and moments of tension. But they took comfort in the small victories, the moments of connection that reminded them why they were doing this. Each day was a step forward, a step closer to redemption. The rhythm of life in Uchi began to settle into something almost routine for Oba and Nkem. The tension that had initially surrounded their return was still present, but it had softened, like a wound beginning to heal. Oba found solace in the fields, where the soil gave him purpose and the younger boys who followed him gave him hope. Nkem, on the other hand, found herself drawn to the quiet moments spent with the younger girls, their laughter and curiosity a balm to her weary heart. The mornings came early, the faint light of dawn stretching across the horizon as the village stirred to life. Oba's day began with the same ritual, washing his face in the cool water of the stream, gathering his tools, and heading to the fields before most of the other men had even risen. He had taken it upon himself to repair the irrigation channels that fed water to the crops, a task that required both precision and patience. The boys who shadowed him worked beside him, their small hands clutching shovels and hoes as they mimicked his every move. "Oba," one of them said one morning as they dug a trench together, "why do we need so many channels? Can't the water just flow wherever it wants?" Oba paused, leaning on his hoe as he turned to the boy. "If the water flows wherever it wants," he explained, "some parts of the field will get too much, and others won't get enough. The channels help us control where the water goes so that every plant gets what it needs to grow." The boy nodded thoughtfully, his brow furrowed in concentration as he returned to his work. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the men began to arrive in the fields, their voices carrying on the wind as they greeted one another. Oba worked quietly, his focus on the task at hand, but he couldn't help noticing the way the men's conversations would pause when he passed by. It was a subtle reminder that, despite the progress he was making, trust was not something that could be rebuilt overnight. Still, he pressed on, determined to let his actions speak for him. The afternoons were no less demanding. Oba often stayed in the fields long after the other men had left, his hands blistered and his back aching from the day's labor. One evening, as he was finishing up, Gora approached him, his expression unreadable. "You work harder than most," the elder said, his voice gruff. "But hard work alone doesn't erase the past." Oba straightened, meeting Gora's gaze with quiet determination. "I'm not trying to erase it," he said. "I know I can't. I'm just trying to make up for it." Gora studied him for a moment before nodding. "That's good," he said. "Just make sure you don't forget what you're working for." Nkem's days were filled with a different kind of labor. She spent her mornings in the communal gardens, her hands caked with dirt as she learned to tend to the crops alongside the other women. It was slow, meticulous work, but she found a strange comfort in it. The women, though still wary of her, had begun to offer small gestures of acceptance, a nod of acknowledgement, a brief word of advice, a shared smile over a job well done. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Nkem hope. The younger girls, however, had no such reservations. They flocked to Nkem whenever they saw her, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they begged her to teach them whatever she was working on. "Mama Nkem," one of them said one afternoon as they sat under the shade of a tree, Can you show us how to make that basket you were working on yesterday? Nkem smiled, her heart swelling at the sound of their voices. Of course, she said, gathering the reeds she had brought with her. Come, sit with me. The girls crowded around her, their small hands reaching for the materials as Nkem guided them through the process. You have to be gentle, she told them, her voice soft and patient. If you pull too hard, the reeds will snap. But if you take your time and work carefully, you'll see how they come together. The girls nodded, their faces serious as they worked. Their laughter rang out occasionally, breaking through the tension that still lingered between Nkem and the older women. One evening, as the village gathered around the communal fire, Nkem found herself sitting quietly on the outskirts of the group. The women were sharing stories, their voices weaving together in a tapestry of laughter and warmth. Nkem listened, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and regret. She wanted to join them, to feel the sense of belonging that had been absent from her life for so long. But she didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. To her surprise, one of the women, a quiet but kind-hearted widow named Adu, turned to her and smiled. Nkem, she said, her voice gentle, do you have a story to share? The question caught Nkem off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She glanced around the group, their faces expectant but not unkind. Slowly, she nodded. I do, she said, her voice trembling slightly. She began to tell a story from her childhood, a tale of mischief and lessons learned, her words tentative at first but growing stronger as she spoke. The women listened intently, their expressions softening as they laughed at the humorous parts and nodded at the moments of wisdom. When Nkem finished, there was a brief silence before Adu spoke again. Thank you for sharing, she said, her smile warm. It's good to hear your voice. The other women murmured their agreement, and for the first time, Nkem felt a glimmer of acceptance. The days grew longer as the planting season approached, and the village of Uchi buzzed with activity. The fields needed to be prepared, the irrigation channels repaired, and the seeds selected for the coming crops. For Oba, the work felt endless, but he welcomed the physical exertion. His hands, once soft and untested, were now calloused and strong, a testament to the months he had spent toiling under the sun. Each ache in his muscles, every bead of sweat that ran down his back, reminded him that this was his penance, a path he had chosen to walk, no matter how difficult. The younger boys continued to shadow him, their wide-eyed admiration a source of quiet pride for Oba. They asked him endless questions, their curiosity unrelenting. Oba, why do we plant the seeds so far apart? One of them asked one morning as they worked together in the fields. Oba paused, his hoe resting on his shoulder as he looked at the boy. If the seeds are too close together, they'll compete for sunlight, water, and nutrients, he explained. But if we give them space, they'll grow strong and healthy. The boy nodded thoughtfully, his small hands gripping his own hoe as he mimicked Oba's movements. Another boy piped up, his voice filled with excitement. Oba, when the crops grow, will we have enough to feed the whole village? Oba smiled, his heart swelling at the innocence of the question. That's the goal, he said. But it's not just about planting the seeds. We have to take care of them, make sure they get enough water and keep the weeds away. It's hard work, but it's worth it. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the men in the fields began to gather for their midday break. They sat under the shade of a large tree, sharing food and water as they rested. Oba joined them, sitting a little apart from the group as he ate the simple meal he had brought with him. He listened to their conversations, their laughter and camaraderie, a reminder of the life he had once taken for granted. Slowly, one of the men, a burly farmer named Nadi, turned to him. You don't talk much, do you? Nadi said, his tone neutral but curious. Oba looked up, startled by the question. I'm just here to work, he replied quietly, unsure of how else to respond. Nadi studied him for a moment before nodding. Well, you do that well enough, he said, a hint of grudging respect in his voice. But don't be afraid to join in. You're part of this village, whether you believe it or not. The words lingered in Oba's mind as they returned to work, a small spark of hope flickering within him. Nkem's days were no less demanding. She had taken on the task of helping the women prepare the communal gardens for planting, a responsibility that required careful planning and meticulous effort. The older women, who had once regarded her with suspicion, began to offer her guidance, their guarded advice slowly giving way to a tentative sense of camaraderie. "Nkem, you need to water the plants early in the morning," one of them said one day as they worked side by side. "If you do it in the afternoon, the sun will scorch the leaves." Nkem nodded, grateful for the advice. "Thank you," she said, her voice earnest. "I'll remember that." The woman, a stern but kind widow named Io, gave her a small smile. "You're learning," she said. "That's a good thing." The younger girls continued to flock to Nkem, their laughter and energy a welcome contrast to the somberness that still lingered in her heart. They followed her everywhere, their questions and chatter filling the air as they worked together. "Mama Nkem," one of them said one afternoon as they gathered by the river to wash vegetables, "why don't you have more children? You'd make a good mother." The question caught Nkem off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She looked at the girl, her innocent face filled with curiosity, and felt a pang of sorrow. "I have Oba," she said finally, her voice soft. "He's all the family I need." The girls nodded, accepting her answer without question, but the words lingered in Nkem's mind long after they had returned to the village. That evening, as the village gathered around the communal fire, Nkem found herself sitting quietly on the outskirts of the group. The women were sharing stories, their laughter ringing through the night as the firelight danced across their faces. Nkem listened, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and regret. She wanted to be a part of their circle, to feel the warmth of their acceptance, but she didn't know how to bridge the gap that still separated her from them. To her surprise, Io turned to her and spoke. "Nkem, do you have a story to share?" she asked, her voice gentle. The question startled Nkem, and for a moment, she hesitated. But the warmth in Io's gaze gave her courage, and she nodded. "I do," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She began to tell a story from her childhood, her words tentative at first but growing stronger as she continued. The women listened intently, their expressions softening as they laughed at the humorous parts and nodded at the moments of wisdom. When Nkem finished, there was a brief silence before Io spoke again. "Thank you for sharing," she said, her smile warm. "It's good to hear your voice." The other women murmured their agreement, and for the first time in years, Nkem felt a glimmer of acceptance. The early mornings in Uchi carried a certain stillness, a brief moment of peace before the village awakened to the rhythms of life. For Oba, these quiet moments had become a cherished part of his day. He would stand by the stream, the cool water rushing past his feet, and breathe in the crisp air as the first light of dawn painted the horizon in soft hues of gold and pink. It was a time for reflection, a time to gather his thoughts before the demands of the day consumed him. The planting season was now in full swing, and the fields were alive with activity. Men and boys worked side by side, their voices rising above the sound of tools striking the earth. Oba had taken on the role of a mentor to the younger boys, teaching them not only the practical skills of farming but also the values of patience, discipline, and teamwork. "Farming isn't just about the crops," he told them one morning as they prepared the soil. "It's about understanding the land, respecting it, and working with it. If you take care of the land, it will take care of you." The boys listened intently, their faces serious as they absorbed his words. One of them, a spirited boy named Tobe, raised his hand. "Oba, how do you know so much?" he asked, his tone a mix of admiration and curiosity. Oba smiled, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "Because I've made mistakes," he said simply. "And I've learned from them." The older men, too, had begun to notice the changes in Oba. Though they were still cautious in their interactions with him, there was a growing respect in their glances, a silent acknowledgement of his efforts. One afternoon, as they rested under the shade of a large tree, Nadi, the burly farmer who had once been one of Oba's harshest critics, turned to him. "You've done good work," he said, his tone gruff but sincere. "You've earned your place here." The words caught Oba off guard, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He nodded, his voice steady as he replied, "Thank you. That means a lot." Nkem, meanwhile, was carving out her own place within the community. The women of the village, who had once regarded her with suspicion, were beginning to see her in a new light. Her quiet determination and willingness to learn had earned her a measure of respect, and though their acceptance was still tentative, it was a start. She spent her mornings in the communal gardens, her hands stained with the rich, dark soil as she worked alongside the other women. The younger girls continued to gravitate toward her, their laughter and energy a source of joy that eased the heaviness in her heart. One afternoon, as they worked together to weave baskets, one of the girls, a bright-eyed child named Amaka, turned to Nkem with a curious expression. "Mama Nkem," she said, her voice filled with wonder, "how did you learn to make baskets like this?" Nkem paused, her fingers deftly weaving the reeds as she considered the question. "I didn't always know how," she admitted. "I learned from the women in this village, just like you're learning now. It takes time and patience, but if you keep at it, you'll become better than I ever was." The girls giggled, their enthusiasm infectious as they redoubled their efforts. Nkem watched them with a smile, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. These moments, small and fleeting as they were, reminded her of why she was here, why she had chosen to stay and face the consequences of her past. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the village, the men and women gathered around the communal fire to share stories and meals. It was a tradition that brought the community together, a time to reflect on the day's work and prepare for the challenges ahead. Oba and Nkem sat on the outskirts of the group, their presence still tentative but no longer unwelcome. The conversation that evening turned to the upcoming harvest festival, a celebration that marked the end of the planting season and the beginning of a new chapter for the village. Elder Oaf, his voice carrying the weight of authority, addressed the group. "This year's festival will be a time of gratitude and reflection," he said. "It will remind us of what we have overcome and what we still have to achieve. I expect everyone to contribute, as always." The mention of the festival stirred excitement among the villagers, their voices rising as they discussed the preparations. Oba and Nkem exchanged a glance, their thoughts unspoken but understood. The festival would be their chance to prove themselves, to show the village that they were truly committed to rebuilding their lives. It was an opportunity they couldn't afford to squander. As the fire crackled and the stars began to dot the night sky, Nkem leaned closer to Oba, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think we'll ever truly belong here again?" she asked, her tone heavy with doubt. Oba looked at her, his gaze steady and filled with quiet resolve. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we have to try. For the village, and for ourselves." In that moment, under the vast expanse of the starlit sky, they found a sense of peace. It wasn't complete, and it wasn't permanent, but it was enough to carry them forward into the next day. The days leading up to the harvest festival were filled with anticipation and activity. The villagers moved with a renewed sense of purpose, their tasks interwoven with the promise of celebration. For Oba and Nkem, the festival represented both an opportunity and a challenge. It was a chance to show the village how far they had come, how hard they had worked to atone for their past. But it was also a reminder of how much trust they still needed to rebuild. Oba spent his days in the fields, working alongside the men and boys to prepare for the festival. The younger boys clung to his every word, eager to learn and emulate the man they now looked up to. "Oba," one of them said one morning as they worked together to clear the weeds from the fields, "what happens if the harvest isn't good this year? Will the festival still happen?" Oba paused, his hands stilling as he considered the boy's question. "The festival isn't just about the harvest," he explained. "It's about the community, about coming together and celebrating what we've built. Even if the harvest isn't perfect, we'll still have reason to celebrate." The boy nodded, his expression thoughtful as he returned to his work. Oba watched him for a moment, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and hope. These boys, with their innocence and curiosity, were a reminder of what was at stake. He wanted to be someone they could look up to, someone who could guide them and help them grow into men of integrity. Nkem, meanwhile, had taken on the task of helping the women prepare the decorations for the festival. She spent her mornings weaving intricate patterns into mats and baskets, her fingers deftly working the reeds as the younger girls gathered around her. "Mama Nkem," one of them said one afternoon, her voice filled with excitement, "can we help with the decorations too?" Nkem smiled, her heart warming at the girl's enthusiasm. "Of course," she said, handing her a bundle of brightly colored reeds. "We'll need all the help we can get." The girls worked tirelessly, their laughter filling the air as they wove the reeds into beautiful patterns. Nkem watched them with a sense of quiet pride, her heart swelling with gratitude for the chance to be a part of something larger than herself. These moments, small and fleeting as they were, reminded her of the importance of community, of belonging. As the festival drew closer, the tension between Oba and Nkem and the rest of the village began to ease, though it had not yet disappeared entirely. The men in the fields began to offer Oba small words of encouragement, their guarded approval a sign that his efforts were beginning to make an impact. The women, too, grew more accepting of Nkem, their once cold stares replaced with cautious smiles and quiet nods. The night before the festival, the village gathered around the communal fire to share stories and prepare for the festivities. Elder Oaf stood at the center of the circle, his voice carrying over the crackle of the flames as he spoke. "Tomorrow, we will celebrate not just the harvest, but the strength of our community," he said. "It is a time to reflect on the past and look toward the future. Let us remember what we have overcome and what we still strive to achieve." The villagers listened in silence, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the fire. Oba and Nkem sat on the outskirts of the group, their presence no longer met with hostility but still marked by a sense of distance. As the night wore on, the villagers began to disperse, their excitement for the coming day palpable. The morning of the festival dawned bright and clear, the sky a brilliant shade of blue. The village square was a hive of activity as men, women, and children worked together to set up the decorations and prepare the food. Oba and Nkem threw themselves into the work, their efforts a testament to their commitment to the community. As the sun began to set, casting the village in a warm golden glow, the festival began in earnest. The square was transformed into a vibrant scene of color and light, lanterns hanging from the trees and tables overflowing with food. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and music, the rhythmic beat of drums echoing through the night. Oba stood near the edge of the square, watching as the villagers danced and celebrated. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to relax, to let the joy of the moment wash over him. Nkem stood nearby, her gaze fixed on the children as they played, their laughter a melody that filled her heart with a sense of peace. Elder Oaf approached them, his expression thoughtful as he addressed the pair. "You've both worked hard," he said, his voice low but firm. "It hasn't gone unnoticed." Oba and Nkem exchanged a glance, their gratitude evident in their expressions. "Thank you, Elder," Oba said, his voice steady. "We're just trying to do our part." Oaf nodded, his gaze lingering on them for a moment before he turned and walked away, leaving them to reflect on his words. The festival continued late into the night, the villagers coming together in a celebration of resilience and community. For Oba and Nkem, it was a reminder of how far they had come and how far they still had to go. As the last lanterns were extinguished and the village fell silent once more, Oba and Nkem sat together under the stars, their hearts full of hope and determination. The road ahead would not be easy, but they were ready to face it together. Join me next time for part 2 of this captivating story. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Before you go, help me grow this community. Hit that like button for more thrilling content, subscribe for new uploads, comment below with your theories and reactions, share with friends and family who love a good story. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for being an amazing part of this journey.